was that easy. I don't have any followers. Anyway, so the sociological connection is going to be based off of the belief that the maturation is not going to work for the explication, but it's going to be circumnavigated or into the proportion rather than the logic of the validity. The validity of the logic is based off of 1,000 followers on TikTok and Facebook and how people are going to recontribute it to the same successful martyr, but the inside edition is not contained from 31% of the population, 83% of the population. Heteronormative. And people are really going to use their stationary perfunctories instead of debate rather than debunking their own cinematic embellishment. Even if that was esoteric, but the region is fundamentally atrocious, and that's why they're going to be extorted instead of the residual income, and resorting in reshrinement for parliamentarian competence is not going to be abstracted into negation of utilitarian bioethics, institutionalized by bicameralism, and cameral exceptions were fundamentally atrocious in 304 BC for the Greeks and the Romans, where they were blasphemed with a Trojan horse, and 304 the Decameron explosion. That was based off Jimmy Carter and possession of 25% of the period when he claimed that the Romans were cartated instead of the $21 of the minimum gap. But the minimum gap of that creation is the same extortions rather than a retroactive provision that is going to be indoctrinated in the next 20 years of the century. And the century is being grammaticalized rather than grammaticalized by the same glacialized imperfections of the Bible, written in order to teleologically conceptualize edifying your congregation and stepping up to the plate. But it's not going to be rooted if you're bound into Kashmir, and then reusing all of the resourceful ethics that are also going to be primed instead of the admissible truancies that are regulated and materialated out of the entire Vedanta. And that's going to be reused instead of the same resilient signature and signed off of the co-author rather than explicated off of the milliandry of the same accept. And then the accept is going to be intolerable because the corporeal system is going to be copulated rather than ovulated from the same amnesial and an amnesiac that is also going to be utilizing the same materialistic functions of accumulation. And how we're going to monetaristically segregate it. It's going to be autodidactically bio, and it's a social opoly and a two-party duopoly. It's not going to be based off the same physical archetype. And the archetype is not monetary inception, but it is monetarianism, which is an economic system perpetuated in the 1920s by John Ferguson. And that was impomulating that there was St. Erger using shank as a indivisible property for an operative condition. And that the operative condition is more standardized than a text, and it's modulated by the same reason, but the archetype is being more politicized than Nancy Pelosi in the House of Representatives, and that's going to be chairing off of the people of the same chromosomal imbalance, but reconfiguring that androgyny is not going to be sanctimonious. And then governing the harbinological deinstitutionalization is not connected towards any objective truth, and that's also going to be reused and cited as an immemorial and complexion, and that complexion is being degraded to the houseable deinstitutionalization of the solar system. And now we're going to be complying that while balancing the solar system with chakra energy and a binary coded in carbon cause of divinity is not going to be regulated because of the materialistic function as the theoretical lineage. And that's why there are fraudulent misrepresentations outside of every American prosperity using their entire justice as a social means rather than a cultural blueprint. And that's why there is an exception that was from John Mayles, who in 1877 that wrote a book that the camels of America to the backs of Helbling, and then which specifically claims in Volume 2, Section 1, there is a positing of the deinstitutionalization of the struggle, how we're going to be able to commensurate with that. But it's not going to be commensurate with that because of the deontological struggle. But it's the deontological facts that are also going to be incorporated so we're able to throw our truth out into the ether and catch a fly, and then we're going to be able to catch your eye. And the eye is the fly, therefore we're degrading the corporeal system so we can manage. And that's why TikTok always justifies the inflections. But going back to his book, which specifically claims Article Section 8, that we're recreating a social sphere in order to control the martyrs over the idealism rather than the inside of the edition, so we can late mark the same task to two guns. And you can call it two federals with a good premium, but the same reaction is a chamber of logic that people use in order to extravagate an entire autopsy of indivisible property, but not the property of indivisible law. And that the law has already been manipulated, so we don't have to nip it in the butt for the paradox of the heat. We're seeing that millions of times instead of 80% of an American thought. But the thought is more nationalist than it is isolationist. For every 100 million Americans that exist in one population desolated, that this is going to be demarcated to the people on the left. And if they believe that there's a political butterfly, so you can capture the eyes by throwing a butter out of the window, in other words, you caught a butterfly, that's just because you have a fisher net, and it's more reusable than that of a material that is drawn from the commodities and the flesh of the bone and spirit of a human being walking on the planet in order to give their piece of the prosperity of what they call truth. And that's why it's inestimable to regulate that same intention off of the extraction nodule, rather than making the nodule of the extraction degraded to the corporeal system and then psycho-managed. But the architecture of that psycho-management is deregulated in its entire efficiency. The law is encapsulated with a degradable housing. This is precipitously when the Chinese government was extracting the causalities, and he specifically argues that we're using anti-institutional arguments and references arguments. We're referencing an incitement off of the logical reasonings rather than giving idealism. Because Frederick Douglass was higher in literacy rates in the African-American slave trade than Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln was extracting his quotes from the Emancipation Proclamation of Honest Abe. So how many more honest incorporeals could you need inside of to segregate the colonists off of the Great Britain? And that was based off of taxation without representation in 1778, and how we were going to repudiate the federal legislation, authorization code of consolidated shipping. What we're really utilizing African Americans is consolidation for embargo, and that we're importing the mercantilist system. We're entitled to that, so we gotta have the tapestry. You're not justifying any type of imperialism because American imperialism comes from Chinese government terrorism and then annihilated by the Taliban. And that was pointed out with Joe Biden. It was precipitously the same indissoluble union encouraged. So why are they encouraged at Flankstein but not going back to the peoples? The people that are now trapped within any ideal. And that this physiological function that you have now imported over the centuries is not going to be made for you to materialize another inflexible entire precipitous action so we can have the entire construct thrown all over the river and never be able to get it over the tip of the Wizardtons. But the Wizardtons are going to be used because they're not going to be able to be extrapolated inside of the same reasoning. Just like geometry is a physiological theory that is based off of the positive logic of John Mills and James Commonly. And James Commonly, which is a mathematician, Scientologist, and indivisible reversibilist, which he claims that there is no ism inside of the spectrum of every syntactical failure, and that your failure to comply with the obligation is why you don't have a contractual cosine delineation. And that you can populate millions of people to go following an ideology that doesn't exist on this earth anymore, and that they're going to do it almost immediately, and they're going to be bringing themselves into the corporate fight. And that's why it's not going to be a metric system, it's going to be a unitarian function. And if they're able to import themselves in that unitarian function for only 3.5% of the time, then the minimum value guarantees that they will be able to logically incorporate that same systematized logical versions, but the version of the logic is opinionated, and it's not going to be corporately opined through the obstruction due to the justice of the monetary creation that is also interdependable. But even if interdependable, we still have a logical creation that is going to mitigate this whole. So you don't have to have a friction expounder related off of the same basis, and that confound the institutionalization is going to be nationalized, but not portulated because of the dehanominity and heteronormative organization. But the monetary and originalism is not going to be coming from the boundary. So are we going to accept, or are we going to deflect? Well, we're astro projecting into what we can only pretend in antecedent holes, and that be cautious with the reconciliation, but it was a reflection of expositors that are going to extrapolate minions, but the milieu that is not going to be fundamentally a draw because we're not going to be debated of an opinion. But the opinion is not going to be covered up because it was a bet and a head and a 100 bet. But it was either covered with 100 bet because millions of people are coming over there to be resigning the cosign rather than focusing on COVID-19 as a problem in the milieu. And the fundamental problems are that is going to exchange an entire property rather than governing a religiocentric ideal that was fundamentally erroneous and governing a structure that stops the misinformation response and encouraging people to get drugs instead of the music that is now imported. Musicology, a belief that was posited in 1870 by Saint Gregory Garie and Albert Schugard. And Schugard was also boundarying that, and this wasn't a Keith F. Muriel impunction of 1870 within his book, The Transient from Music, and how we're able to use that in order to obtain what we want, such as in specifically Chapter 1 and Section 2 of the article of the book, claiming that we are the monetary pillows of fascist deities that we use to expose any type of triumphant that we may have or not have based upon any disagreement or agreement. You don't have to agree on everything, which is based off of a human natural incline subsection. But that doesn't mean that we have to use a populace for every type of androgynous whole that we use in order to contextualize our entire freedom. Our freedom is not negated by the holes that we use in order to make that a freedom-based society, but solely based off of the entire nihilistic ideal that you can go create your own will based off of not willing anything but being nothing. Being an entire inception of ex nihilo is a contradiction on its own action. And that's why inane propositions such as going and majoring in ignorant studies such as the lesbian dance theory is going to make a selection source bias rather than completing any type of circummission so we can circumnavigate the reasonings of that philosophy for Magellan. Magellan is a lot cooler than Justin Bieber based on Alex Jones in 2018. But it's precipitously what a belief in any type of populace is not going to be thrown to the degraded holes of materialism. That's not going to be bounded because he exported the holes for your people are going to be susceptibly decided off of individual franchise and chastity. You don't need the chastity hole for femboys because the only thing they're going to do is going to regulate their entire coil. We knew this from the very beginning. Why are we having a conversation about something that happened in 1860 Why are we having another conversation about something that happened in 1790 in the Ptolemaics when they were reversing the Bulgarians and then having a revolution in order to franchise the colonists, and then they degraded the entire system. It fell apart almost immediately right after they threw chastity all over the place and made sure that we're not going to have a delirious anti-cellular impunction, so we can have the freedom navigate a reaction chamber, so that would be distributive toward the options menu. But we're reborning the great CBBS of the backs minimum on Washington Post, and then franchising it. Washington Post 2018 claimed that we are the objective sailors of truth that are going to be made off of not being notorious and tolerant bigots, but telling you the real news of what's going to happen today, the life of every October and in September, based off the Gregorian calendar, or even the Julian calendar, if we have an occasion that happens. And that we're not going to be able to be sent inside of the Senate majority of the House. Our representatives are higher than that of our own logic. So we can reason within that logic and vary within the opinion, and we didn't have to have the opinion based off of the reason. Because the reasoning of that action is why it's more integratable. I have much more integrity to go leverage my entire system based off of an uphind order rather than having a fallacy inhibited based off of the conjugation. But the conglomerates of acknowledging martyrs is an extrapolation in its inception. But it's set daily for the red pill and the blue pill argument. People are having an assessment argument with freedom, but are not degrading the Russellian monism that exists in the Ramsey intergenerational validity, and that's just why reciprocal determinism is going to be a problem. It's a boondoggle, but it is a natural state of sanguinity that is not going to transcripturalize that same inception, but this transcendentalization of innumerable assertions are thrown into the direction. And the direction is reported, but it's not a dog chain, so you have to strip people of their freedom in order to have your freedom a habitable hole, because we don't have to dig you a hole in order for you to jump in it. You already jumped into what you can only imagine, and not being able to see what happens after that imagination falls apart almost immediately. And that's why it inhibits, but they're more interchangeable, but incorporable within that interchangeable degree. And it's more important than not having a franchise belief, because there's now a desertable action. That's the safeguard, which you don't have to be vanguardist on the left or vanguardist on the right, but it's going to be based off of the same belief, of the same precipitous action. Of Woodrow Wilson and what utilitarian bioethics that reciprocated to Judaism and juvenile delinquency, it was going to be reported because of vigilantes such as Spider-Man. Well, it was just a fictional character that was representing 85% of American prosperity, and how we don't have domestic tranquility, and our enumerated rights fell apart based off of the same intangible benefits of law, and how really getting physicals from the doctors based off David Pakman's show are really not helping people to get healthier. So why would you go to a doctor in order to get a physical? Because the physical is only a bribe from you getting a less chance of having a vaccine imported in your body, or having a chance of going outside and getting a cold because it's too cold outside. And that's why it's called a cold, for one of the reasons of its name, but that pseudonym applies to the sobriquet, and that's why there's a higher comorbidity to get a cold outside for 85% of the chance in Oklahoma that wrote the decision than that for you to get tagged by a bee, and then you have to worry about how many times you're going to get tagged by another bee, and it's not going to be based off of the same truism. But this guarantees you the free agency in order to compete in a law of potentials, and that the potential of you being able to get a bee and then being stung by that bee is going to be the same potential you're able to amalgamate. Ramming in a thicket is differentiated to the religious ideal of how you're able to incorporate these healths by astrological, by medicine. And that medical astrology is a pseudoscientific implicit bigotry based off circumambulated, extrapolated belief. That how are you going to make people more accultural from holistic medicines that only existed in 304 BC within Greeks that were basing martyrs off of Mormondy, and then they were implexifying that this was going to be not only the impossible, but also the phyllic shorts within that same phosphophylable, and then the phone booth was contaminated within the same policies of the bonus. But the bonus was getting to the deal, so we didn't have to make people more believe with the rah-rah royalist technique, and they were just going to fall out because they didn't have any other ideal other than what they stated, and that they stated primitivistically. And they didn't have any another inception for the incorporation, because it's based off of another false truth that negates its entire belief system, and then that's also incorporated within its entirety of this degradation. And if you're degrading the system, why have a heteronormative portfolio? You can only justify what you can only dream to do in the inception of reality. Tying yourself to the belief is going to make a illusion and making that creation of the wipes that are disinfected. That's not going to be rejected because you believe that you're an Alvin and the Chipmunks, an unapologetic parody of a social blot. But the social blot is being rooted out. So why do we have a problem with going inside of Walmart, but then claiming that a black person is going to be discriminated if you go walk inside of Walmart and you're white? Well, as much as times as a white person walks in Walmart is as much as times as a black person is not going to be discriminated based off of their color. Precipitously because it's not that prevalent within Walmart. Walmart is much more of a family bargained company that is being purged only for their taxes and unitarian function. So they're able to distribute much more of the discrimination laws and then anti-discrimination laws. The Anti-Defamation League would correlate that out by every other leftist provision. But since you have a revisionist history of it, then you wouldn't have to go inside of Walmart and worry about being discriminated against, because you could be discriminated against on any type of caste system as long as it's a human categorization, such as race. Gender is a human categorization. There's only two genders they would claim, and that this would offend certain other people, and it would claim that you have a neuropsychological nerve damage to the brain that when you go to lynch this, and that you're attempting to be, well, you find me offensive, I find you offensive for finding me offensive. And this is one of the imminent in session of Encore in 2006, rather than slipping a psychophobia and claiming that it's sesquipedalian. You don't have to always be able to assassinate people like Abe Lincoln and Corpus and then alleviating the Demarcus because you believe that you have groceries in your pocket, but you're trying not to steal them in order to make a stereotype even much larger over the stratosphere. We don't believe all black people are the same. That's why we're not treating them the same as certain people would, and that's why we would incorporate you in order to have that type of code of conduct put into your laws and now to comply with the creed, with the niacin, is what is going to be incorporated, because the expositors of that reason is going to be indefallible within that union. The union extrapolates the entire vulgarity of your problem. The problem is not the metaphorical belief of the solution, but the adjacent proposition to what logically accepts the validity of the date. But the date of the validity is the day that there will be pigs flying into hell and a snowball will be able to be fired, and fire will be able to be snowball, and that Aquaman will drown and Human Torch will start swimming. And that's going to be an absurd proposition on the fat blunt trace of its own entirety. We don't have to make it a message board for that same deregulated Diopolis. So why is there a habitable order for people who don't believe that there's going to be an intangible benefit for the transient notion? Because the intransient notion only exists for improprieties rather than governing of verbosity of the same reason. But the reaction chamber is also dismissal. And that the dismissive incantations are going to be abide based off of the homeomorphic exceptions. But the exceptions to a massive rule are why there's not going to be an intangible benefit to the exception of a massive rule. And just if you're inclining people to shift them into a nudge hole, then this libertarian paternalism, this is why they negated you to propertize your entire formation in the system, because you can't believe in anything other than yourself. That's just solipsism economically. And we're not going to use sociological solipsism, because if we use that inside of a law, we're only going to perpetrate that only one part of mind exists in a reality, and you can't believe anyone else. And if we believe another person, then that's because we only have an aggression to believe in what other does an interpretation of what we believe in. But it's not what you believe in, it's what you think you believe in order to believe in it. And that's why belief is a medium to knowing, just as much as knowing the belief is going to get you in a lot of trouble in order to be struggling with the interpretation of the reasoning of the belief. But the validity is much more frequent than the coherent theory of the justice within that belief system. And this is not impermanent because of the theory of justice in 1971 by John Rawls, which was a political theorist, and he was also a conspiracy theorist and a Scientologist expropriationist, claiming that there was going to be a negation to a exception. Now, if we would just have 100 IQ, just as John Rawls did from Ben Shapiral's perspective, then we would be able to rule out all of the inequalities that exist inevitably in our rule of law. And if we started out with the same amount of money and the same amount of temposity, then we wouldn't have to incorporate that temposity off of pervasiveness. But it would be veracious to have a loquacious durality in order to be the durable in solution. So we do not have to compatibilize the portfolio of the stock market, for example, because people have a monetary inflection to commit X, then commit Y. And since we're committing Y, we're reciprocating the action to millions of people who commit the other action. And that the action is notified by much more of its grain-related systems. And the whole of action is a solipsistic version of reason. And that the version of reason is going to propagate an order of rules that you have to delegate your direction. And that the Rule of 21 is not going to be formulated because we have a political organization and we have to hack that out in real time. And that's not going to affect millions of people till this day. It's still incorporated off of the same benefit. So precipitously, you're doing the exact opposite of what you believe you were doing in order to justify that same rule, in order to shift and meet people there. And that the best policy is the rule of law that is educating the policy, not giving out the data and objectivity, because most people fell out, and that's only going to be prohibited to more so the people, rather than whether out the rule of every type of esoteric nationalist formation, such as white supremacists have much more of a higher tendency to go and vote for Donald Trump than that of voting for Obama. It's only because that he was a Republican GOP sophisticator of the candidacy, and that's why he's the middle finger towards the solipsistic Trojan horses of the Democratic Party. And that's based off of their perception of the Democratic Party versus the reality of the situation. And that the Democratic majority is not direct democracy. And that's a different version of democracy. So there's types of everything, so there's specifically types of socialism and types of capitalism. And that there's pink capitalism for the Trojans of the Unitarian falsification module. But that module is not going to be accepted because millions of people believe there's going to be equality for all. There's not equality for all, considering that there is privileges that other people are not able to leech. And so if you're leeching onto another person in order to get a bachelor's degree, that's because you went into a college and you nationalized healthcare. Well, that's just national sovereignty from Canada. And also, even New Jersey has a socialized healthcare medicine institution with universal basic income. And that's also why Medicare for All is much more a Bernie Sanders proposition spitting into the ether while he's calling out to the majoritarians that consider themselves a populist notion and enfranchising sovereignty off of the silent majority. And if you believe that the virtue signaling comes from the parliamentary confidence, then you do not delegate a control because people sit inside of the House longer than that of the Democratic vote of 34%, and that's populated by the polls of 2010 based off of the Democratic majority versus the Republican minority, and then it was sublimated by CNN. Hey, that was the cable news network that was also franchising that Don Lemon claimed Jesus wasn't perfect, and then he was criticized by all of the priests, and that the priests were coming over there to baptize. An urban priest, specifically from Cuban, and that was talking about Cuban socialism, saying, well, we believe in Cuban socialism, but we don't believe in the fact that Jesus wasn't perfect. And it doesn't mean that we have a disbelief in the interpretation of what Don Lemon was attempting to incorporate verbatim his words. And also saying that there was going to be an encouragement of the study, but we're not going to be able to get a fiscally positive outcome solid. If you're a fiscal conservative, then you have to buy into the philosophy that you've already lost, which is why you're negating and negative limited activity because you're not going to be able to construct that same belief in the system. And that's why we're positing the epigram there has been uber supportive. And that's not going to be a grip of the idea of stockpiling the wheel. That's a theory. Well, the stockpiling wheel theory really deals with John Mayles and Joseph Trotsky. And that Joseph Trotsky was a Scientologist philosopher in jail, and John Mayles was a sociologist, experimentalist, and he was also a deviant economic polymer. When he would talk about the economic scale, such as the urban rule is not based off of the golden rule. We standardized that the $333,000 that had been exposited in a corporate sovereignty is not based off of political amnesty. We don't need an amnesty deal in order to solve every solution to this political lie as a whole. But we supplicate that it will damage the future and interiorable generations. And that these are matured rather than being perturbed because we don't need another sink erger off of the point with Al Gore's fake lockbox. And if you just speak in a condescending voice like Ella Jones and Vince proclaimed, you'd both have them going against each other and coming at their franchise from the multinational news media and how we're going to be exogenously incorporated. But that's just really a component of the system, not a franchise administrator. We don't need entrepreneurs to run an administration. We already have an administrative command system from the philosophy of Soviet Union, which is Marxist-Leninism. And if we antagonize that with the Soviet-type regimes in 21st century, which is in our current year of the century, and that we base our current year off the century in order to monetize that with the value, with the refurbished module, so we would always have to monetize the monocle. But we don't have to go back and forth in order to make it sabbaticals, and it would be relativized if we enticed everyone to believe in the same thing that we do believe. And it's not the reason that you have to believe in the same thing everyone else believes because of the same thing that you don't believe in, which is not the freedom that's unconstrained by duty. So that's why we have enumerated laws and we have power. One reason, that's just the Joseph Kony complexion. He uses much more of a spiritual medium and a supernatural deficiency. But you don't have to decriminalize his argument because you believe he's a politicizer. But he is politicizing the whole of logic in order to reason with the validities that are now naturalized to then psychedelically use that and appoint it. But you don't have to approve of its own variation because validation is not based off of approval. You don't need approval to validate your position, in other words. Your position is based off of the status quo you inherited by future birth deficits and then reimpinged by impoverished belief systems that are encompassed. That is based off of a fundamental ideal. The ideal is that we can extrapolate the bioethics that we implicitly fortify by the Constitution. A non-disclosure agreement is that of a premium desiccation. If you defecate premiums, you only defecate people problems, on a solution, and that we're not going to universally urinate out of our own Megarian system. So why are we using uranium in order to expositate all of the nuclear reactors? Well, that's because 31.5% of our minimum value has been deteriorated based off of the daily value. So the daily value of how much coal we burn is based off of climate change mitigation? No, it's going about the mitigation reactor syndrome that comes from climate change, such as rising sea levels and in lower fertility rates for those who import more clouding inside of the sphere. So this is why radioactivity exists. So once you get an ionomer, that's a radioactive decay. No, it's measuring that the radioactive decay comes from a natural explanation to explain a physical phenomena, such as trees are disappearing instead of the west. And we've seen this instead of every type of material, and using wood in order to expunge it inside of paper, and paper's made from trees, so technically money does come from trees, but only the certain type of ingredients. Cotton, when L. Whitney and L. Gin. And in cotton gin and L. Whitney, that was the progenitor of cotton gin, also it progenerated that to desiccate in 1751. And if we wanted domesticating a dedication, we wouldn't be having to use a universal boom in the 1920s where economics was booming because of the carbon tax, and it was an eco-divisible in purpose. And now we don't need divisible in relation, so it's specifying the supervisions that we're able to incline off of what we're indoctrinating ourselves to believe. And every type of reason that is not justified is justly proven in the opposite direction of its own reversal in position that is instrumentally connected to the same Marxism that existed in the 1850s and in 1848, which was based on the progenitor of Frederick Engels and Karl Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto. And then that was irregulated in Verito, which specifically in Das Kapital, Volume 3, specifically talks about climate change and global cooling more of a problem than global warming. Global warming is just based off of the heat propagations ever since humans were able to walk on 2 feet. And all of the Celsius unisaries that were empalmerated inside of the hockey stick graph, that it was 243 degrees Celsius and 473 degrees Fahrenheit. Well, it's only based off of, if every degree is based off of the longitudinal areas of the world and how we're able to permit that by seismic graphs for every earthquake we have, then erosion does happen from colliding with millions of animals that walk around the earth, and that is going to populate the environment based off of 3.5% of area, and then the range of the perimeter is going to be based off of the same deregulation of the solar system. And as solar winds are expounded by the hydrostatic equilibrium of a thermic boundary and hydraulic fracturing, where you're attempting to put oil inside of the ground by force and then neutralizing it with a ROGAM puncture and then puncture in the ground. Well, acupuncture is going to be deserted by 0.00000.1% centigrade. So why do we have every cell miniature that is also imposed by every ability board? Because the reason of what we're going to incorporate is not going to be indivisibly purposed, but we are going to purpose that because if you met a retarded canine grade for ruling elect, that's just going to be your exception. But it's only fit of one if you were born with a set of horns and that's not going to be in purpose because you believe that you're going to be encapsulated. And if Dr. Kevorkian was working through these lives, you'd scream, "I'm still alive," driving on top of your house and put it at the top. And if you wanted to run with that top of the house theme, then you could just break it and smoke it the black of blenders and powder with rip roaches and lighting up like jack-o'-lanterns for Halloween. Well, it's only because the lightning comes from the radioactive decay that is mannered. But then that wouldn't be radioactive. It would just be isotope. It would be drainage of the same nuclear fission. So why are you not combusting that to the same inimmutable atrocities that are imposed? But the diosophy that is only going to be interchangeable, that's going to be reutilized for the same Unitarian focalist social system. That way we're able to comply with the same solar ecosphere. But the ecosphere is an IS chamber. So the chamber is going to be diluted inside of the atomic range for the belief in a habitable order. And a materialization of the habitable order is not going to be exited